But thank you very much for coming, David.
Okay. Well, thanks for having me. It's always fun to be at the Oxford Internet Institute, and actually I thought as an opening, this is legalese. This is actually coming from what's called the Intelligence Reform and Terrorism Prevention Act of 2004, which was passed by the U.S. Congress. It's an esoteric section called Section 1016, but it actually defines what I'm going to be talking to you today. And in it, Congress was responding to the events of 9/11, and if you remember that the 9/11 Commission came out with the famous phrase, there was a failure to connect the dots. And essentially there had been information that could possibly have mitigated the 9/11 events, maybe not prevent it, but mitigate the negative consequences from it. And so they actually said that the president shall create an information sharing environment. Now, in their wisdom, when they said an information sharing environment, it gets handed to the executive branch, then the executive branch says, okay, fine, there will be the information sharing environment. And so that actually explains what I do. I started the job about 5 months ago with the information sharing environment as their executive for innovation, integration, and interoperability. Essentially that means trying to bring together data across many different sectors, and I'll talk about it. But I wanted to show this because it actually is kind of fascinating for a piece of law that they actually go and they describe the attributes that this information sharing should have. You can see it has to connect existing systems, has to ensure direct and continuous online access to information. That's not too bad of a problem. Has to have no single points of failure and allow users to share information amongst agencies, among levels of government, and as appropriate the private sector. Connects existing systems, and as you go through it, you can actually see that they actually were very prescriptive in terms of what it can actually do. Most interestingly, it says, allows a full range of analytic and operational activities without the need to centralize, and permits analysts to collaborate both independently and in a group. And if you actually go down even further, has continuous real-time and immutable audit capabilities to the maximum extent possible. Now, of course, as we know, WikiLeaks happened, and while it's actually that we should be doing information sharing and protection, that's one of those things that up until now has pretty much been an unfunded mandate, and now, of course, we expect that there will be emphasis in the states to do both information sharing and protection. So, with that said, I'll talk to you a little bit about what is this information sharing environment and sort of the challenges that come along with it. So what is the information sharing environment? Well, as I mentioned, there is a piece of law out there, and it was actually amended in 2007, but basically it says that we're supposed to be bringing together the defense, the intelligence, the homeland security, the diplomatic, and the law enforcement communities at the federal as well as the state, local levels of the U.S. government. In addition, we're supposed to be working with international and private sector partners and having the appropriate information seen by the appropriate number of people. So it's not that you show everything to everybody, clearly, but you're showing the right things to the right people at the right time. Bit of a challenge. On top of it, if you actually look at IRPTA, it actually talks about that it's really about supporting what we call the front line of investigators, analysts, and operators. People often ask, well, what about decision makers? And that's where we say that's a mission space. So it's not our space to actually try and inform the decision makers. It's to inform that investigators, analysts, and operators need the information to do their job and then pass it through whatever chain of command they have, be it law enforcement with cops, be it with the Defense Department and the Pentagon. That's for them to decide how it actually gets to their decision makers. We don't try to get to that. So clearly what was funny about this is when Congress passed this, it said it would be done in 180 days. Clearly they didn't quite understand the extent of what they were asking to be done here. So, but like I said, I've been here for about 5 months. By the way, make this as interactive as possible. If you have questions, feel free to interrupt at any time.
But what, on these analysts,
right,
investigators, operators, how removed are they from decision makers, or what is the next?
So each of these different cultures. So intelligence, you have probably thousands of analysts, probably in the order of tens of thousands of analysts, who basically have different things they're focusing on. So someone might be focusing on North Africa, some might be focusing on a specific part of North Africa, maybe just be focusing on economics. And so they're producing reports. These reports are then aggregated, and at some point, hopefully, that is seen by a decision maker. In the United States, we have the National Intelligence Council that produces national intelligence estimates. That's often how they're seen. You may also be familiar with what's called the Presidential Daily Brief, or the PDB. That is also when the president gets information coming from analysts. Investigators, that's more on the law enforcement side. That's where you've got FBI agents doing cases. The challenge with law enforcement, of course, is a lot of things are considered law enforcement sensitive. In other words, it's an ongoing investigation. So you cannot necessarily make some information available unless you're cleared to see law enforcement sensitive data. What's also implicit behind here is, of course, we have all levels of classification. You've got unclassified as well as you're talking about secret and top secret data. And we should keep in mind that just because something's unclassified doesn't mean that everybody should see it. For example, DEA agents, Drug Enforcement Agency agents, they're undercover, but they're undercover at the unclassified level. So you should not show information that blows their cover to people that aren't read in to actually know that they're undercover and what they're doing. So it makes interesting challenges in terms of what can people see, who should see it, and how do you know if they can see it or not. So basically we were established after 9/11, and again, that's the Intelligence Reform and Terrorism Prevention Act of 2004, which was later amended. Basically, with the purpose of trying to align the policies, processes, it's not just a technology solution. In fact, I often say my job is probably about 15 or 20% technology. It's really 80% policy. And it's actually trying to promote timely, actionable, and relevant information regarding counterterrorism, WMD, and Homeland Security. And it's implicit throughout the entire thing. It actually calls out and says that we should also be protecting privacy and civil liberties and civil rights. So a large part of our job actually is focusing on how do we protect privacy of U.S. persons? How do we make sure that you're not being brought in if you actually into the system and having your data tracked if there's no reason to be following you? And this is a big challenge. Because of course, if you think about it, when in the cycle do you become a suspicious individual? And what we've actually spent the last 4 years doing with the information sharing environment is to, as much as possible, make it behavior-based and not about who you are or your gender or your race or anything like that. So it's about what you do, not who you appear to be. So again, here's just a little bit of the scale of what we're trying to do with. There's over 300 million people in the United States, 50 different states, some territories as well, 3,000 different counties. We also have to respect that this is not just about federal, state, and local. This is also about tribal. We actually have over 500 federally recognized Indian tribes that have their own laws and their own autonomy as well. In some cases, autonomous from the federal government. So we have to respect that. Over 18,000 different law enforcement agencies, over 1 million security personnel. That includes both local cops as well as private sector cops. And basically the expectation of privacy for all U.S. persons. So this is a bit of an interesting challenge. At the same time, we want to prevent the next 9/11 so that Congress doesn't say, well, why didn't you bring together the information? So it's a fun challenge. So just to sort of give you ideas, in 2004 is when the 9/11 Commission report came out. Then there was an executive order that created what's called the National Counterterrorism Center, or the NCTC. They are one of our primary customers. There's also what's called the Terrorism Screening Center, TSC. You've probably heard about them in terms of producing the no-fly list, the watch list. They're the ones that produce products that then inform who can get on planes, who should be held back, and who should be held back for questioning. It also created what's called the Information Sharing Environment. So then we went operational in 2005. Basically, there was additional things that were created, including there was a need to call for what was called an Information Sharing Council. Now, this Information Sharing Council includes both representatives of the federal as well as state governments, but also representatives from the private sector. So it's a very interesting council that informs the president in terms of what we should be doing about privacy protections, what we should be doing about information sharing. A large focus on it is really on privacy protections. Then in 2006 to 2008, you probably heard, or you may have heard about what's called fusion centers. Well, what are fusion centers? It's really recognizing that there's a disconnect between federal governments in the United States and state governments. Federal government does intelligence, collects information about what's going on overseas as well as within the United States. State governments really don't have the resources to do that. And so one of the things that rose out of 9/11 was that there was a disconnect between states knowing what they should know and the federal government. So fusion centers are really an effort to try and bridge that between what the federal government has at the classified side versus what needs to be shared with state and local law enforcement in the state sides. And so those are fusion centers. There was additional amendments. Then basically, then 2009, of course, then we had a change in administration. During that time, there was some updates that were made. And then come 2010, of course, now we have WikiLeaks, and now we have an emphasis on the need to do both information sharing and protection. And so we expect that 2011, at some point in time, you'll see there'll need to be a national strategy probably on information sharing and protection. So The other thing that you can sort of see is as we move progressively further in terms of the things that have been done. So this is starting with 2007, there was a interagency threat assessment and coordination group that was really trying to bring together representatives from local government, state government, as well as from tribal government. So tribal government into the federal government to actually inform what information should be shared to prevent terrorism acts. There was also quickly recognized that we actually did not have a way of identifying across the board the common ways of treating unclassified information. So while we have standards in place for classified information, some things were being labeled for official use only. Well, if you go to the Department of Justice, they're going to treat for official use only differently than the Department of Homeland Security, different from the Department of Defense. So there was no common agreed upon definition across them. And so that actually took about 1.5 years of getting people to actually have all their different markings for unclassified documents to reach consensus about what they meant. How long did you have to retain those records? Could it be shared with the press? Could it not be shared with the press? All these different sort of policy-related actions, not technology-related actions. Like I said, fusion centers got established. There was also what was called the nationwide SAR, which is short for Suspicious Activity Reporting Initiative. And what this was doing, it actually got started at the local level, was that cops for the longest time have always been doing suspicious activity reporting. It's basically where they walk around the neighborhood, they say, do you see anything odd? Do you see anything suspicious? This was trying to actually formalize a process that protected privacy, but at the same time allow local and state law enforcement to pass on tips to the federal government if they saw something suspicious. And we wanted to make sure that it was behavior-based, not based on the appearance of a person. So it was actually agreeing at what point do these behaviors reach the point where they should actually be passed along to the federal government as being suspicious. And what are they?
Although, I mean, some behavioral indicators are, I mean, like seeing kids on a corner, for example, they
Right.
tend to be
Right.
particular profiles. Or
It could be, certain behaviors could be based on, well, we're trying not to base it on your age, or
Yeah.
it's essentially, are you not responding to questions? Are you taking several photographs of a federal building, that sort of thing, that no matter who you are, what gender, what age, whatever,
Mm-hmm.
that's enough to be suspicious. It may be, and there's also then a sanitizing mechanism that at a certain point, if it doesn't reveal itself to be anything that's disparaging or anything like that, then your information is removed from the system.
Yeah.
So it's really just trying to actually reach a common way to agree upon this, but at the same time not infringe upon people's civil liberties. So that was the suspicious activity reporting. Then in 2010, it was recognized that, and I'm sure this is the case in the UK too, that each of the different departments and agencies had spawned several different unclassified networks that were not interoperable with each other. So we often say that Google has it easy because they can search everything on the web and they don't have to worry about who are you in terms of what they show back to you. The trouble that we have is, of course, you've got the Department of Homeland Security. It's got its information. Not everybody in the Department of Homeland Security should see everything in the Department of Homeland Security. So you actually have to say, what user are you? What should you be able to see? And that's just within the Department of Homeland Security. Then you've got the Department of Defense. Then you've got the intelligence community with their 16 different agencies. And so Google had it easy because it didn't have to worry about federated institutions. But by having federated institutions, the very thing that sort of serves as the checks and balances in our system of government, it makes it very difficult to find information across the federal government. And that's not just at the unclassified level. You can also see here we have secret networks. Same thing's true with our classified networks. They are federated in nature. Different departments and agencies have different networks, and it may very well be that information on one network cannot make its way easily to another network. So we're essentially trying to do the internet for government, but at the same time maintain the firewalls or the institutional firewalls between different departments and agencies. Makes it a bit challenging. And then cargo screening is another one. But what you sort of see as we move forward on is that increasingly we're having to bring together many different departments and agencies. These are actually just a sampling of them. And so I often joke that my job is to take on the mission that no one department or agency can do, because it's not clearly defined as any one person's turf.
what is the population that you define that you're dealing with, though? I mean, you're not dealing with agriculture or
No.
health or anything else.
Well, health we would deal with in terms of bioterrorism. That would just be a
Okay.
small percentage of what health would deal with.
Okay.
Department of Interior we would deal with, believe it or not, because of Indian tribal relations with the Department of Interior. Mainly, though, it's Department of Justice, FBI, Department of Defense, the intelligence community, Homeland Security, and then Department of State. So and that's at the federal level, and then you have, at the same time, there's many different law enforcement organizations that represent the different states. So you have to talk to all of them, too.
one more interruption before
No,
you
go
go.
ahead.
Because you mentioned this, WikiLeaks creating a push for protection.
Yes.
But in a sense, I mean, you've got this challenge of sharing government among these agencies, and one interpretation of WikiLeaks is you're doing a pretty good job. It's just that was an insider,
Right.
and if it could have been more targeted of saying we need to deal with insider threats rather than
Dealing with
sort
information
of
protection
trying
across the board.
trying to overreact to the fact
Right.
that you're trying to connect people.
Yeah, I think WikiLeaks, so it's interesting to watch what's happening. I mean, there's always been a push. So before 9/11, there was a predominant culture, and that's partly why we had these siloed, non-interoperable networks to err on the side of need to know. And so if you didn't have a need to know, you didn't know about the information. But obviously what 9/11 showed is it's very difficult to predict who should have a need to know, especially in a fastly changing world. So to pendulum something the other way. I think WikiLeaks has sort of served as a way of opening up that entire argument of what's the right balance between need to know versus need to share. Because we do know that at a certain number of people, you will probably have a spy. And if you have a certain number of people, you will also have someone who could be blackmailed by spies. So it's not just about the insider threat, it's just about, in terms of if you move the pendulum too far to need to share, are there other threats that you don't know about that are probably likely occurring? And so that's what's serving as a discussion. There are some people that have publicly said that it will actually be increasingly difficult to keep secrets. I personally have no one opinion either way. I do think it's something where we may overclassify certain things, so maybe one solution would just be to have less classified material. That way you could actually have a tighter control over who's seeing it. But it is a very valid point that with WikiLeaks, if you actually look what happened, he was allowed to take an electronic device into a secure area, which you're not supposed to do. He was allowed to exit that area with the same electronic device, which you were not allowed to do. And he was able to burn a CD without it being logged. So really, if we just had those protections in place, it would have been stopped. But as all things, these things sort of take a life on their own. I think what it's done really is just sort of open up the wound of how much do we err on need to know versus need to share. And it's quite understandable, for the people that are on the immediate front line that are collecting information as human assets, that if their cover is blown, their lives are at risk. You can see where they would be very much on the side of just need to know. Similarly, we spend billions of dollars on technologies for collecting signal intelligence. You can imagine that if that information gets out, then you've just thrown $1 billion down the drain. So it's understandable why some parts of the government may have the need to know sort of as their rallying stump. At the same time, it's interesting. You actually get the Department of Defense for the warfighter pushing much more for need to share. And that's because they're in the front line. They need to know, is there an IED that someone else has picked up, an unexploded, an ordnance, an unexploded improvised explosive device that we need to know right away. So they're pushing as much as possible to get as much information as possible to the warfighter. Now, of course, if you actually look what happened with WikiLeaks, it was a warfighter that unfortunately serves as the insider threat. So there's interesting challenges, and what I sort of go forward and say is, you need to recognize that each different department and agency has its own distinct culture that may err on the side of I need to protect my human sources, or I need to protect my technology investments, or I need to get as much information as possible to the warfighter. And really what we're trying to do is find a balancing act amongst all of them. But it's hard.
Can I ask a question? Just on that latter point, why do you think there's a government-wide balancing act? You almost said in so many words in the sentence prior to the phrase balancing act that each agency has its own balancing
True.
act.
So the reason why it's a government-wide is actually the program manager for the information sharing environment, which is my boss, who's equivalent to a 3-star political appointee, is appointed by the president. He actually has the power to mediate disputes amongst departments and agencies. So let's say, hypothetically, Department A has information that Department B wants, but they're not sharing it with Department B because they feel like they don't protect information appropriately. Then he would be involved with the dispute in terms of let's investigate the issue, what's really Department B's need to know, can we actually sort of convince Department A that there needs to be appropriate protections in place. And so it's not that you have to find a common fit-all solution, but you need to at least have the policies in place to actually get the information to the right places so that people can do their jobs. And the challenge that we have is increasingly the threats that we're facing as a nation, and I would say as a world, don't reside in any one department's swim lane. That what you see in Department of Homeland Security is relevant to the 16 different intelligence communities, is relevant to the State Department, is relevant to the Department of Defense. And they do need to share, but they need to share appropriately. And that's hard. So, this is why I get up at bed every morning to tackle the problem, and usually come home at about around midnight. So, this is actually from the Markle Foundation report, which was actually published as sort of Markle was a big sort of thought leader that actually led to the creation of an information sharing environment. They were a think tank. And they basically said there's a clear connection between cybersecurity and information sharing. The same technology that will improve information sharing is a critical part of protecting. I'm a big believer of this as well, because if you think about it, if you know who somebody is with a digital certificate and you can actually know what their roles are and what they should be able to see, and you have the data tagged as to what it is, and then you have the right engine to make sure that the right people can see the right things, you also have the ability to do recommendation engines, or say that, I see that you are an analyst at this fusion center focusing on these issues. You might want to know that in the last 72 hours, other analysts that are also focused on this issue found these documents useful and actually suggested to them. So we can actually move, instead of just doing searching where the human's searching for information, the information can find them, sort of discovery. Now, that's a bit of a challenge too, that we actually have to tag the data, and you can imagine most of the legacy data is not tagged yet. But if we can move to that, that actually would be an ideal state where the information finds you, as opposed to you having to know that it's out there.
Let me ask about which kind of technology are you using for this type of
All
checking?
sorts, because we have to use existing systems. That's the other thing that makes my life fun.
You need to have some kind of standardization even on technology.
Well, standardization, so the approach that at least we're approaching is that institutions have made their investments on different systems, and it was their choice. But what we can do is at least have standardization on that middleware or that gateway that's exposed to that institution, so that at least the gateways can speak the same language, and then there's a translation layer once you receive the information to translate it to, let's say you're running Linux and somebody else is running Windows 7, you can do the translation back and forth as appropriate. So, but of course you have to reach standardization on that, you're right. That's a big challenge. And up until now, even if you define standards, as you might know, how you use the standards also needs to be defined. So it's not just enough having the standards, you also have to do the profiles and actually prescribe, here's how we're specifically using the standards, and that's a bit of a challenge too in government. So I would suggest to you that protection and sharing represent two sides of the same coin, and so these are then sort of what we're trying to do. And this is sort of now with me coming in with this position, and again, I can't claim a honeymoon period much longer, but 5 months in, that we really are trying to look for a way to provide both information sharing and protection mechanisms to all participants, recognizing that they reside in different institutions that have different infrastructure investments, have their own different firewalls, and we have to respect those firewalls and are operating at different levels of security clearance. Need to ensure protection of privacy, civil liberties, and sensitive information. Support both authentication, knowing who you are and actually seeing that you should actually have authorization to the access, control process to discover data and services across all networks. Essentially, my vision is that you never actually have to have the data be sent to you, but that you can navigate through this layers of the federal government as well as state and local governments with your identity credentials, sort of with your passport. And there will be checks and balances as you navigate through these layers, saying, yes, you can see this now, or no, you can't see this, or you can see this if your superior weighs in and says you have the right need to know. But essentially what we're trying to do is make it so that you can navigate through these different layers, which, again, Google had it easy, Amazon had it easy. The internet, they basically assumed is that all people have all access. And that's the big challenge that we've got here, is when you become federated. And of course, we need to also be able to do audits. And we need to do audits in a federated approach. One of the hardest challenges, and I've talked with several people about this, is how do you do federated search with meaning? Because you could just do search where you pull 5 different search engines and you just throw them together. But as you know, that's not ranking the pages, it's just pulling the results together. If you really want to do sort of federated search, you need to agree upon how are we doing our page ranks, how are we doing our hash tables, so that when you pull back those results, you can actually meaningfully assign them. Well, that would require us to basically have everybody have one standard for a search engine in the federal government. And again, that's not going to happen. So right now, people have to run queries on many different source engines, and the best I can do is what's called bundled search, where essentially I am running many different queries, returning the result to you in an aggregated batch form, but that doesn't mean I've rated the pages or anything like that. So just search alone is difficult. You can also imagine the problem of audits. How do I do a sort of a pooling of audits where you're keeping an audit in your one agency, another one's keeping one other agency? If I pull that together, can I assemble a picture of the patterns of behaviors? That's also difficult. So these are interesting challenges that probably when we were doing the internet we didn't really think about, which is how do you respect institutional autonomy while at the same time wanting to have that sort of horizontal data capability across them. And I'm sure the UK has these same problems.
Mhm.
Not to mention across the EU. You probably have it harder with the EU because it's not just that we have 50 different states, you now have many different countries with many different national laws. So these are ongoing developments. The nice thing is we do work, well, my boss is a political appointee appointed by the president, so we have the ability to inform both the national security staff, which was previously the National Security Council, with this administration, as well as we can also then reach out to the Office of Management and Budget, so we can also help with budget projections and what budget actually gets assigned to federal governments. For state and local governments in the United States, the federal government does not determine what money they get. It's their own budgets. But there are grants that are given by the federal government, so that's another way that we can also encourage what gets done. So that's a combination of our carrot as well as our motivating stick. So here's our aspirations, though, is that, again, you have different departments and agencies, each with their own different user directories, each with their own different sort of institutional investments in terms of their databases as well as their firewalls. And we're trying to actually have this sort of connecting capability across them, where they can basically run a search that searches across the appropriate resources for that individual. They can have information, find them for that individual. But at the same time, we have to respect all the policies. What I'm getting really interested in, and it's not here yet, but we are seeing standards groups like the Object Management Group, as well as OASIS, begin to develop vocabularies for policy semantics. And essentially, that is actually then allowing you to have a way of standardized expressions of who should see what. Because once we have that agreed upon, then at least 1/3 of my job is basically to implement that, and then I need to at least tag the data and know who people are. Now, one of the challenges we have in the United States is, as you can imagine, departments and agencies make different investments. We are now at the point where we're going to have 5 different national standards for identity management. So, standards. You have the Department of Defense doing what's called PIV. You also have what's called the Federal Identity and Credentialing Access Management FICAM Roadmap. You have NSTIC, it's a National Strategy for Trusted Identities in Cyberspace, and you have GFIPM. So I now have 5 different standards, which don't align one-to-one, that I now have to develop some way of actually trying to exchange someone's identity in FICAM to NSTIC to GFIPM. And that's a big challenge. And we haven't even begun the data tagging problem and agreeing as to what does this data tag mean, who should be able to see it. With policy semantics, some states, a mayor can see law enforcement sensitive information. Other states, if a mayor sees law enforcement sensitive information, that's a criminal offense and he's going to jail. So we also need to be able to encode those rules and as to who should be able to see what, and have the system be able to know that. With the added caveat that, again, the law said I have to do this with existing systems, no new systems. Makes things fun.
What about the historical information there? How you solve this problem? I mean, have a huge
Legacy?
Yeah.
Yeah, I think the best solution there is at least you can go back, and if you can't extract the tags from the data itself, because maybe it's in PDF form and maybe it's got it written in, you just have to basically label it as, it may be lower than this, but the highest we think it is secret or something like that, so we're going to treat it as secret even if it's lower than this because we want to err on the side of caution. So you just have to do like batch labeling of the historical information saying that, to the best of our knowledge, we think it's this, and you have to err on the side of caution. Yes?
Is the labeling issue one of the sort of classification of something like secret, top secret, classified, whatever?
Yes.
Or is it an issue of labeling the content, the substantive content of the document?
It's both. Now, I would just like to solve the first one first,
Right.
just because then at least I could show it to you.
Yeah, much simpler, because that's already been done to a certain extent.
To a certain extent. The trouble is you get into compartments and things like that, and certain caveats like, can it be seen by foreign individuals, can it not be seen by foreign individuals, and so. But at least at the classified level, at least we have agreements as to what those terms mean, for the most part. The unclassified level, we haven't. Now, there's what's called the controlled unclassified information, CUI, which is about to come out. There's an executive order that was passed, and in the next probably 6 months or so, there will actually be an XML standard for actually tagging information that we can actually know, is that law enforcement sensitive? is that pre-decisional? Is that for official use only? And then actually agree to how we treat it. But I've thought of things like, well, maybe we could do like a equivalent of a Google game, much like the where we could basically have two people. What do you think this is? Do you think this is law enforcement sensitive? Someone else does, and if so, then we can make it some sort of reward system. But even then, especially with budget cuts, it's hard to find people that will have the bandwidth to wade through all this legacy, these volumes and volumes of legacy data, and actually tag it. So the other option that I've sort of talked with other people is maybe we just declare bankruptcy and then just start anew, saying from henceforth, this is what we'll do, and all legacy data, good luck trying to get it.
Mhm.
But then you're throwing away a lot of institutional knowledge.
Right.
It's the challenge of how do you keep government up with the changes in technology.
Right, now is the problem though then, the problem here is managing access. It's not that you can't take these data in whatever form and give them to someone, because they have to be in electronic form to
Right.
begin with before you care.
But usually they're in scanned form, which makes it difficult too, because then you want to be able to extract that. How can you remix data? I mean, ideally, we'd like to get a place where the analyst can pull data that they need to appropriately to their desktop and then be able to remix it to produce analyses.
Right.
I mean, a lot of people, I know Bill and I have had this conversation that the intelligence community is not 24. Actually, it's a lot like academia. I mean, it's based on a publication model, and that you are actually rewarded for producing papers of relevance to national security concerns, and it's a publication cycle. And in some ways, the same challenges with academia. If you can't access the data and trace its legacy, or what we call its pedigree, your whole analysis might be in doubt. Because it may be later you find that what you thought to be true, the source was found to be lying, or the source was found to be erroneous. So now your whole publication that was based on that data needs to be called back, retracted, and a new one put out. So that's what a lot of analysts do. And so, yeah, we need to first get access to the data, and then we need to have it in a remixable form that we can actually know what it is. And it's a huge challenge. So yes, so I would be able to call it a day if in 5 years I have actually interoperability across the enterprise architectures of federal, state, and local levels of government. And again, recognizing that I cannot directly control what they invest in. I cannot directly control what they spend their money on. I can influence, I can try and encourage them along, but they will choose to make their own choices. So that's always the fun. We do have, at the top level, we do have that information sharing council, which is now part of the national security staff, where we convene people and bring them together, and it's by consensus that we're trying to get them to do things. But of course, leadership by consensus has both its strengths and its weaknesses in trying to get people to do things. And what we're also trying to do, and where I'm trying to go is, especially with budget concerns, there's no need for us to build the same system 12 or 15 different times. What I'd like to do is actually have remixable components. And we'll get a little bit into this, but this is threatening a lot of the existing industrial models in the United States. I mean, there is a huge, huge, huge industry that grew up upon, I will build you a monolithic solution that'll serve just your needs, and then I'll update it every 3 or 5 years. If I'm now shifting to more of the Droid model or the Google model where, no, let's just build components that can then be reused by other departments and agencies, that threatens that industry. They would much more prefer to sell you the same thing 12 to 14 different times and have to always update it and have sort of lock-in as opposed to modularized components. But I think that's where we need to go. And that's where we then get to this slide where if we can actually get requirements across government for departments and agencies for counterterrorism information sharing, then we can actually come up with an agreed-upon architecture and governance loosely. I mean, we don't have to get down to the specific details of what you do, but we can have at least an architecture that does this. We can then have service specifications. We can move to an SOA model as opposed to a client-server model. And then we decide whether or not we want it to be developed in-house, because maybe it's a sensitive component or it's something where the government has expertise, or we choose to have industry do it, build and test it, and then we can reuse it. So that we don't need to have multiple search engines, multiple investments. We can reuse that same search engine for different departments and agencies. But again, I am threatening industry with doing that. Now, what I'm hoping is I can impress upon them that in some ways it broadens for those people that already aren't in with departments and agencies, it broadens their possibility to get in. We could also move to a subscription model. So that instead of you paying once for a search engine for your department, you pay for a monthly transaction cost of how many times that search engine gets used. You pay $5 a person or whatever. And then that's a ongoing source of revenue for an industry as opposed to a sunk cost for one investment. So it's moving government more to the sort of Apple iTunes store model or the Amazon sort of store where we're moving to services where they can download and remix these components. That is a bit revolutionary for government.
Mhm.
It's not how it's done, it's procurement. But, especially in an age of where we got to be sort of fiduciarily responsible, tight budgets, I think is where we need to go. And it's basically sort of negotiating with industry that instead of us paying once for one thing, we're going to pay you an ongoing cost for reusable components that we can then update. That then also requires us to get industry to agree upon some standards amongst its own products so that you can swap out, here's this product that came from Amazon, we're now going to swap it for Google, or this thing from Lockheed Martin. You can swap out the components. So we're engaging them in dialogue. In fact, a lot of my job now is actually engaging industry in dialogue so they can begin to build products that actually align to the standards we're adopting. But then you have the challenge, and industry rightfully so, of which they say they sometimes feel like they're the Charlie Brown to government's Lucy, where in the past the government has said, here's this football, here's our standards football, if you kick this, we promise, everything will be good, and at the last minute we yank it away. So we need to basically have some more authority to actually convince them that, yes, if you invest in these standards and build a product, Homeland Security really will buy it, as opposed to going for the cheaper solution that doesn't use these standards. So the final top onto that is while we're working with groups like Object Management Group, OMG, and OASIS, and we're also talking some to W3C, the time it takes to reach standards takes too long for government. I mean, we're looking at a lifespan of 2 to 3 years to reach some agreement, and by the time you have, industry has changed, government has changed, the nature of the threats have changed. So if anyone has any suggestions on how to fix that, I would welcome that, because I don't know how to do that. Other than you have to play the game and have to push forward where you can, but we would prefer as much as possible to have faster ways of reaching agreement on information standards for government.
It's moving towards some kind of clouding.
Well, and that's where we're moving to cloud model, yes, and that would allow us to at least have a loose couple of clouds, but we have to have agreement on, how do you expose Department of Homeland Security's infrastructure, Department of Defense's infrastructure, and everything like that, and of course then convince them that it's secure. So that's part of the challenge too. But that's where at least where I see us going, if we can make it. But that's assuming that again, that things don't come to a head beforehand, like maybe the government stopping next week.
Not to mention that.
So that's it.
Yeah.
I'm open to questions if people have thoughts. I do. You can actually sign up for our website. We are pretty public. We're pretty visible, and it actually has more details about the efforts we're doing.
From technological point of view, that's my a little bit. Say, are you using, let's say, open platform yourself? You say you build what you have,
Right.
But you have to integrate this technology. I mean, how you?
How are we doing that?
Yeah.
So in the United States, there's a thing called the National Information Exchange Model, or NIEM, which interestingly enough just got adopted by Canada. And so while there is www.neem.gov in the United States, there is also now a www.neem.ca, because they actually adopted the same standard. And what that is it describes both standards for sort of legacy backend integration, as well as a message that could then map. So if you do your legacy integration, I do my legacy integration, but we both map to NIEM, then we can actually have a common way. It's sort of like Esperanto for information. So that's NIEM. We also are pushing for open source tools that then allow you to do the integration using NIEM. And one thing that I'm sort of pushing for in the next 6 months is what's called a UML, Universal Markup Language, profile for NIEM, so that all the tools that are used for UML could actually be used to do the integration. So that would at least allow us to agree to common ways of sort of speaking the same language despite our own legacy investments. But NIEM by itself does not describe so it doesn't describe the process or the business profile, it's just more the vocabulary. So we also have to do the process mapping. And a lot of what we do, especially because we have to respect privacy, is we can't just agree to this common ways of saying things. We also have to agree to common ways of doing things so that we respect privacy protections. We have a way of filtering for this is not behavioral based, so that information should be thrown away, so it's not seen by federal investigators.
Go ahead.
Yep.
Yeah, no, I was wondering, I mean, you mentioned UML here, and so to what extent is all of this XML based?
Most.
Most, okay.
Except for the legacy investments, which of course, but
Right.
most of this is XML. But even then, as you know, XML by itself, we can all be using XML and not be able to share any information because we're not using it in a common form.
Right, then you've got to share the STDs and the tags
Yes.
and so on. But does the, okay, So is there a government-wide XML standard then for tagging, for, there's a,
Right. So for tagging information, so the controlled unclassified information will be in XML and will be the government-wide standard for controlled unclassified information. It was interesting because it was actually our group that actually initially sponsored it just for counterterrorism, and that's when then the government said, oh, this is going to be great, we'll use it for all purposes. But that's just for tagging unclassified information.
right,
And even then, it's just tagging the access to the data. It's not tagging what
not
it
tagging
is.
the content?
Right.
Okay.
So there is no standard for that yet.
Right, and that was leading me to my next question, which is, how does this relate in very concrete terms to someone creating a document? Does that mean then that you no longer accept Word documents, that everything has to be, even word process documents have to be XML based?
Well, the good thing is actually the current version of Word is XML based. So
Sort of.
Sort of.
Yeah.
So basically, it would just mean is that there would be appended to it. You'd probably have a tool in your own institution, and it could be many different tools where you just say, I want to tag this as the following, and it would actually append it to the file.
Mhm.
Or you just put a wrapper around whatever the file is.
Mhm.
But yeah, basically, with this new standard, it's actually being done by the National Archives and Records Administration. So they're the ones in charge of it. Basically, all records will need to be stored using this standard.
Mhm.
So,
Mhm.
and that's something that, at least on the intelligence community, they've always been doing on the classified side, because they always have to tag what is the level of access, who should see this, when can it be declassified, if ever, and who's the authority that does it. So that's actually been pretty mature on the classified side. It was the unclassified side that was actually running a little bit more chaotically.
Mhm.
But it still doesn't have reached consensus on how do you tag the actual sort of content of it is not agreed upon yet.
Right. So now, if you're talking about interoperable components and reusable components, to what extent are you talking open source?
Probably a lot.
Mhm.
But I personally am fine whether it's open source or not. I just want to basically be something where if I choose to change my identity management provider,
Mhm.
I can rip it out and put in another one and it won't break everything else in the chain. Or if I want to change my auditing provider, I can rip it out and not break the chain. And that then allows different departments and agencies to make their choices as to which one they want to use, but it's in a standard context. And what we can do is through our Office of Management and Budget say, for FY 2013, any investments you make in this area have to adhere to these standards, else you can't spend the money.
Mhm.
And that's how we would at least begin to get sort of homogeneity across the government.
Right, but then you have, of course, that solves your federated problem, because individual agencies can make choices. It promptly creates the political problem you mentioned a little while ago, which is that lots of vendors like to sell big monolithic,
Yes.
we not invented here, or solutions that we've invented here for the very first time.
Right.
And of course, the FBI's case file system was one of the
Decades still in, yeah,
Well,
it's still coming
they were-
along.
Yeah, I mean, that's one of the more, whoever sold it to them, and I don't know the details, sold them like an incredible piece of junk.
Yes.
It's very hard to believe that it was an intelligent decision on the FBI's part, unless there were some payoffs involved.
Yeah, I don't know. But I do think you're right, that the government has had a history of procuring monolithic solutions that only meet specific needs, or if they work at all. So that's just going to be where you're just going to have increased scrutiny as to what the money is being spent on. And at the same time, you don't want to do an overly bureaucratic process, but you do want to make sure that they're... And it could be, like you said, if you don't get enough of a signal for industry to spend the time to do this,
Right.
they're not going to do it. So it may be that you're going to have pilot grants, you may have to have X prizes. I've strongly supported that we think about either crowdsourcing or X prizes as a way of sort of motivating spaces in this area. We just have to navigate the whole budget procedures to actually do crowdsourcing in government. But we're working on that, because I agree. And that's where I'm hoping that maybe it's going to be not the large monolithic industry contractors that are going to be the first to adopt it, but it's going to be the more agile ones that see this as a way to get into this space. If we can demonstrate that there is an opportunity for them to sell reusable components with a subscription model instead. And it can be open source, that's fine, and what you basically are doing is we're getting your unique customization of that open source, plus then we have a counter, much like a copier, that says you've done 1,000 copies in the last month, you now pay this to the sort of steady stream revenue. I would love to have in 5 years the version of a government store where you can download, here's what I want to use as my identity credential provider, here's what I want to use as my auditing provider, and you can remix as appropriate. But that's going to take a while to get there.
Go
I have
ahead.
a couple of very general questions. Are probably given all the legislative mandates and so forth, I guess you have to take sort of a rational, comprehensive approach to some of this. But it strikes me that when you talk about the person you report to having the authority to resolve disputes and so,
Right.
it seems that that's a gold mine in terms of if you incrementally solve problems that occur. In other words, take the opposite approach would be say, okay, maybe most departments are doing most of the time something that has evolved over years and decades of
Right.
mistakes and successes and so forth. So if we just solve problems as they occur, then pretty soon we're going to patch together. I'm thinking of the railways. I
Right.
mean, you know, the safety on the railways is usually by every time there's an accident, you investigate it, you try to figure out what was the
Right.
problem and
Go
solve
from
that
there.
throughout the system.
I think you're right, and I think that's actually been the approach that we've been taking. There are some things that nobody wants to take on, and they don't necessarily. So for example, at the unclassified level, there's what's called IntelLink, IntelLink U, which is for the intelligence community with their analysts. There's also what's called LEO, Law Enforcement Online, that's for law enforcement investigators. There's also called RIS, which is used for state law enforcement investigations. And then there's HISN, which is a Homeland Security Information Network. 4 different networks, all different platforms, many different users. What was interesting was we started hearing from local and state analysts as well as investigators and operators that they would like to have interoperability across these networks, to be able to search. So if someone's on IntelLink, they'd like to be able to search these 2 or 3 other networks. So we actually went across this, and we actually did this with a data-driven approach where we said, well, first is how much of an overlap is there between these 4 different communities? And surprisingly, we actually found that there was actually less than 2%. So they are unique niches, so they actually serve a purpose. But the information they have on these different networks actually is of value to an analyst. May need to know what's going on in law enforcement investigation or vice versa with intelligence. So we started down the path of trying to do search across those networks. But no one network investor was really interested in doing that. And so that's where we've really had to put some of our own resources and our own sort of motivation behind it. It was almost sort of the tragedy of the commons. Because no one person owned it, no one was trying to tackle that problem. But again, we have to work with existing solutions, and so we had to sort of bring them together, had to get them to begin to explain what their different enterprise architectures were, what they were using, and they were initially resistant. But once they saw that this was something their constituents wanted, then they actually got more motivated to do it. But so that, I guess, is where he is using his authorities as program manager to actually try and convene people and get things done. The thing that we find is you can use your authorities in so much to the extent that the White House is willing to support you using them, which is a political thing.
Will the White House get involved in these kinds of issues?
Oh, they do, well, the meetings we have, the governance meetings, are at the White House level. So,
Okay.
so basically, what we are involved with is we have a interagency policy committee. These used to be called presidential policy committees underneath the past administration, which are convened with the White House authority. And basically, you're assembling departments and agencies as well as representatives from the state government to basically make decisions on how are we going to protect privacy, how are we going to, what are the rules that go into fusion centers, what are the rules that go into watch listing. And then I have the fun little category of information migration, which includes the sensitive but unclassified networks, secret networks, what's called data aggregation. So how do you pull together unstructured as well as structured data in a way that actually looks for non-obvious relationships? This is obviously informing watch listing and concerns with sort of if there are bad actors out there. And we actually have just started, we're starting on the path of creating a standard profiles group.
Yeah, but this is, I mean, the database, I mean, you're completely different. How then communicate each other, structure and non-structured data?
Right.
Where you can come with, that's the...
Well, and that's where you have to have that agreed upon what is that standard profile that serves as that Esperanto between those 2 different databases. So you may be using this sort of structure, someone else may be using this one, you have to reach that agreement. Some other places have solved it, but simply they try and suck as much data as they can, but we don't like that approach because then you have more silos. If you don't have interoperability across databases, if you're just pulling everything in, then you're just creating another silo somewhere else. But right now, that's currently state of the art.
No, stay together. I mean, it's not that you...
Right.
You communicate each other about structure and non-structured data.
Right.
So you have 2 different type of structure.
Right, and that's where, especially for unstructured data, that I haven't seen any good solutions right now for that, other than you share it in whatever form you can, and then often people are doing custom mapping or custom integration on the back end to bring it in. Now, what we would hope to is move to a future where it's equivalent to sort of, I want to use the analogy of either Napster or BitTorrent for databases, where someone could pop up a database onto the mesh and say, here's what I have, here are my ways of expressing things. If you can accept or receive any of these, then I can share data with you. That's where we hopefully move down to, but that's a service-oriented architecture that we're not there yet for doing. But interestingly enough, actually the department that's actually the furthest ahead in adopting this is actually Department of Homeland Security. And that's because they had to do this themselves, because if you remember, they were created as an amalgamation of many different departments and agencies to begin with. So they had all these legacy systems. It was sort of like a micro version of the federal government of trying to do integration amongst these different investments.
You have also this geospatial data. How are you dealing with them?
Well,
Is
fortunately,
it-
geospatial, there's actually a lot of standards coming along in that area, because industry has been very, and that's actually maybe the model that we're looking for, is industry was very interested in having standards for geospatial, because
Yeah.
then they could sell products that handled the geospatial investment. Now, of course, what you have to remember is actually Google Maps came about as an investment through InQtel, which is sort of like the think tank generator for the intelligence community. So actually, InQtel's investment in Google Maps led to the commercial product that now we all use. And so geospatial actually has some pretty well-defined standards in terms of how you can share information. We're hoping to do the same thing for data tagging and the same thing for identity management, if we can get industry excited about that. They're not excited right now. It's too hard.
We just have another very general question about cultural change, which is this, you mentioned the culture of departments, but when my work in the UK with governments, trying to get them to do collaboration or anything, it just seems a culture of protecting information and controlling information is so strong in most departments.
Right.
I guess the question is, well, to me, I imagine most of these departments already have a strong culture of protecting the information they have. And it's the real problem is to get them to share,
Right.
changing that culture of sharing. And to what degree is that culture shift taking place? Or what are you doing to try to
Right.
shift that cultural?
Well, and I think, so the interesting thing is I think a lot of them saw with 9/11, they saw that if they didn't share, it was sort of like, you can either hang separately or hang together, and so they recognized that there was a need. The way I sort of see it is I'm not trying to change their culture in so much as understand the root cause of why are they motivated to protect their information. And that's where, if I go to someplace like the CIA, their sources are all human operators that are basically in the field, that if their cover gets blown, people die. So if you can convince them that this process that you're enacting will not compromise the identity of those individuals, then they're more likely to share. Similarly, if I go to, say, the National Security Agency, theirs is more on signal intelligence, and it's more on what they're collecting in terms of what they're hearing and things like that. So you need to convince them that the information, if shared, will not erode the investments they've made in their technologies. And so it's beginning to understand that. Equally, then I can go to other sources like the Department of Defense and the warfighter, who wants to get the information to the warfighter, and they can actually be one of your strongest advocates of the need to share. And so you actually, when the whole WikiLeaks thing has begun unfolding, it's interesting. If you actually look at some of the comments by the Joint Chiefs, they're saying we need to make sure the pendulum doesn't swing too far back to need to know. And that's because the Department of Defense wants to make sure that their warfighters are getting the information. So I look at it as not so much that I'm trying to change as I'm trying to understand the unique different cultures and then find a sort of way of balancing across those different ones. Because I don't think I can actually unless I fundamentally change the nature of the business of what they're doing, they actually probably are right to have that sort of concern about needing to protect, need to know. So I think the more challenging question is how do you allow or encourage the sharing of money across departments and agencies? Because that's what they're more protective of.
How do you allocate the money?
Right.
That's what the big
And that's
problem
again
is.
where I sort of go back to, well, if you look at it right now, our very system of budgeting, one, it takes 3 years for you to, if you're going to do something new, you've got to identify it 3 years before you actually will ever see the money. So that creates a need for people, I hate to say it, to sort of fudge their numbers because they never really know 3 years in advance what they're going to be doing now. So they sort of leave themselves room for sort of dealing with it. So they're a little bit scared there. 2, in the government, if you don't spend your money at the end of the year, at least in the U.S. government, you not only have that money taken away, but then you actually have that subtracted from your budget next year. Not just the amount that you didn't spend, but it's actually a double hit. So you have every incentive to spend all your money specifically for yourself. And then what was also interesting, if you actually look, the EPA was actually created by pulling money together from many different departments and agencies. Congress didn't like that. So they actually passed laws saying you cannot do that in the future.
But you cannot do, for instance, some kind of real-time auditing concerning the money. So this is, you can address this with much better on
The numbers, I mean, the reality is anytime you do a data call, it has to go through so many layers, and there's so many people that are going to sanitize it, so it's hard to track the money. But I think that really is the crux of why we cannot be as responsive as we should be currently in government, is there are not incentives for, if it's two different department agencies came forward and say, this solution will benefit us both, then OMB can say, okay, well then I'm going to give you more money to it because you've shown that it's not just going to serve your department, it's going to serve both. And then if a third one comes along, they'll say, we'll give you even more money because now you've got three different people benefiting. So we really need to rethink the policy of how do we reward collaborations in government.
Probably what I see, because I'm dealing with the European Union, same question of budgeting, money, distribution, etc., is they do not have a good best practice to show them the potentiality of this type of tools.
Right.
This is still missing. So, yes, they are afraid, for instance, because of course you are checking them. You know if they do frauding or non-frauding with such system. So they would not like. For instance, I was involved in European Union for IBM on developing such type of system.
Right.
So the first thing that happens to me after I design the system, I say, now you go away. And the reason why, for this type of afraid that if they bring the information another place and then you implement such type of things, you destroy them itself. You don't know what happens in the future with the information. And not only this, there are projects. Projects means, are the projects well allocated, funded? Are the projects producing that impact? And you can identify this, and they don't want this one. But my feeling is they don't have a good best practice to show them, as you say, that could be bring benefit, incentive, and things like this.
And I would also hate to say it, I mean, this is maybe I'm being a little cynical, it may be that you have to recognize, this is also, that in the United States, the White House is actually really poor. Because you have to think about it. Who's assigning money to the White House? Well, that's Congress. Well, what are Congress? Congress are state representatives as well as local representatives, and they're going to be thinking about their state. They're not going to be thinking about the White House, which is also, it's a check and balance system. So very rarely will you see any money assigned specifically to the White House. It's usually assigned to a specific department, may even be assigned to a specific department's activity in a specific state. But, it's the whole budget system, the way it's done. I think it worked for everything that we were dealing with, from the time that the United States was basically created, which I know is kind of laughable in the UK, since that's a blink in their eye. But anyway, from the United States was created until probably about the 1990s. But what I would say now is that the speed at which our world is changing is inefficient for the way the model of government was produced. And so the question is, what I would love is the president to turn to either the National Academy of Sciences or National Academy of Engineers and say, we need to rethink about how we organize how we do government. And come back to me in 3 to 6 months, and what we'll do is we'll do a pilot, because things are changing so fast that you cannot do incremental changes. You're really just putting a Band-Aid on a Band-Aid on a Band-Aid. You almost need to do a pilot where you sort of have someone that leapfrogs so far ahead and says, here we'll demonstrate how this works, establishes the best practices you were talking about, and then figures out a transition plan for the rest of the government to catch up. I'm just worried that's not going to happen, because unless there's a crisis that is politically too much capital to be spent to get things done to do that. But I am worried that that we, both as a nation but as a world too, that events changing in this world are happening so fast that we almost need to rethink. Because at least the whole purpose of having DC and having everyone clustered in DC was that communication was expensive. You had to ride by horseback. Well, that's an outdated thing. We don't need to do that anymore. The very nature of sort of having siloed departments and agencies was because we thought we were confronting an enemy with the Cold War that could penetrate us and could penetrate all parts of the government. So we had our little firewalls. Well, that may still be possible, but you have to weigh, is that protection worth it versus the need for collaborations and sort of horizontal capabilities across government? So you have to rebalance that. But I guess the phrase is, we're always fighting the last war. In some respects, we're not appropriate for the times we're facing now. But that's why I serve. I'm here to try and do the best I can within the position I've got, and as my wife knows, bang my head against the wall as much as I can. So.
Not sure there are many organizations that are really ahead of the time either.
No, I can imagine. But that's where it would help
Yeah.
that, I mean, the nice thing about the OII is you're able to see across many different disciplines, and there may be emerging trends that may actually be able to inform this area.
Well, this is a great example of information sharing, and I very much appreciate
Thank
it.
you.
And, I don't know if there are any other questions, but I think you'll stay along
sure.
for a while if there's informal discussion. But thanks for coming on a late Friday afternoon, and thank you, David, for stopping. I know this
Appreciate
is
it.
keeping part of your your holiday.
Oh, this is fun
Terrific,
for me.
absolutely terrific.
Thank you.
Thank you. If we can get a copy, if I can get a copy of your slides, we'll put that with the